Good evening, everyone. Chris McGarvey, one of the pastors at Bethel Baptist Church, and we're back here tonight for the fourth installment of our Tough Questions series. We're taking 6 weeks here to look at some faith-related questions that are, commonly troubling. They're oftentimes asked of Christians and of Christianity. So in this series, we're doing these for 30-minute blocks. These are certainly not going to be exhaustive answers by any stretch. Really what I hope to do is just provide some helpful food for thought and kind of an outline of a Christian response, Christian perspective to these questions. And also, we'll point to some additional resources if you want to pursue these questions further. So far, I've addressed why does God allow so much suffering? Isn't it intolerant to claim that there's only one way to heaven? And last week, how can you take the Bible literally or seriously? Those are here on our Facebook page. You can scroll down and watch those later if you'd like. Just a quick word about format here. Like I said, it'll be about a half hour. And we're also planning on doing like a junk drawer session, an Ask Anything session for the last week. And so if you'd like to submit a question really on anything, any kind of question, hard question for Christianity, for Christians, you can submit that in the Facebook comments. If you have a Facebook account and are able to log in and submit a question, that's great. If you don't have a Facebook account, or if you prefer to send a question via email, you can send that to toughquestions@bbcde.org. So Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo.org, toughquestions@bbcde.org. So you can do that tonight or anytime. So let me just recommend these books again. The one by Tim Keller is called The Reason for God. And then secondly, this one is called Confronting Christianity, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion. It's written by Rebecca McLaughlin and really excellent. In fact, I think her chapter on science and Christianity is even better than Keller's and really helpful. And I'm actually going to lean on it unashamedly quite a bit tonight. So just say that at the outset. So tonight's question, hasn't science disproved or at least undermined Christianity? Hasn't science disproved or at least undermined Christianity? So I don't know if you noticed this in the news, but back on March 3rd, Liverpool lost to Chelsea in soccer. I was not following this, but there was a video that kind of went viral after Liverpool lost because their manager, Jurgen Klopp, was interviewed in a post-game press conference, and a reporter asked him his opinion about the coronavirus. So this is March 3rd, and the concern was starting to build, and so he gets asked this question, and here's his response. He said, "What I don't like in life is that with this very serious thing, the coronavirus, a football manager's opinion is important. I don't understand that. I really don't understand it. It's not important what famous people say. We have to speak about things in the right manner, not people with no knowledge like me. People with knowledge should talk about it. I don't understand politics or the coronavirus, so why ask me? I wear a baseball cap and I have a bad shave." And he said all of this with a much better accent. My opinion is really not important. And so that portion of the interview kind of made its rounds on the internet, went viral, and a lot of people liked it and resonated with it. And so basically what Klopp is saying there is, you know what, stay in your lane. We should all stay in our lane. We should stick with what we know. We should stick with what we're good at and what we have some understanding of. So should I just bow out right now before I betray my ignorance? I'm a Christian pastor, not a scientist. So am I shooting myself or inadvertently Christianity in the foot by addressing this question and being the one sitting in the chair here? Fair question, which is why I am certainly not going to pretend to be a scientist tonight or an expert on science. In recommending, these two books, both of the writers are not scientists. They have advanced degrees, but they are engaging with those who are experts in their fields. And so they quote scientists. I will be quoting a number of scientists tonight. So anyway, I will try to stay in my lane and let the scientists speak about science. So again, this is going to be a thumbnail sketch. There's loads of books out there, and there's so many different topics under this umbrella. There are college and graduate, postgraduate classes on all of these issues. I'm only aiming to give a framework for wrestling with the question, a brief response in a sense, and just to get you thinking and point you to others that you can pursue to study these things further. So the outline for tonight, 3 main points. Does science demand or point to atheism? And so undermine Christianity's claims. Secondly, what are the origins of modern science and scientific method? And then third, we'll look at a few examples of issues that are typically used to undermine or disprove Christian faith, like miracles and the creation account. So does science demand or point to atheism? What are the origins of modern science and scientific method? And then we'll take some examples of issues that are oftentimes used to undermine or disprove Christian faith. So first question, does science demand or point to atheism? So I remember one time being on an airplane and sitting down, and I'm an introvert, so I don't do this too naturally, but I struck up a conversation with the woman next to me, and it turns out that she was a scientist and a biologist and had a PhD, and I asked her if all of her study of biology and all of her scientific research led her to marvel at God's creativity and design. I think I maybe asked her, has it led you to worship God or doubt his existence? And she appreciated the question. She was thoughtful and I think even wrestling with it, maybe not thinking too much about that question previously, at least in an explicit way. If I'm remembering correctly, I think she said she gave evidence that it probably has done both. I think she had some Presbyterian background, and she said, I'm kind of a Christian with a Buddhist overlay. So I don't know what all that means, but anyway, the question stands, does science demand or at least lead people to atheism as the most fitting worldview with the evidence, with the data? Has science disproved or at least discredited Christianity? So there's plenty of voices out there that would give a resounding yes response to that question. So Alex Rosenberg is a pretty outspoken one. He's a professor of philosophy at Duke University. He's the author of The Atheist's Guide to Reality, and in it he writes this: there's so much more to atheism than its knockdown arguments that there is no God. So he's saying that atheism does have knockdown arguments that there's no God. But he said there's a whole worldview that comes along with atheism. It's a demanding, rigorous, breathtaking grip on reality, one that has been vindicated beyond reasonable doubt. It's called science. Steven Pinker, who's a professor of psychology at Harvard, concurs. And he says it like this: the findings of science imply that the belief systems of all the world's traditional religions and cultures are factually mistaken. So it doesn't seem like they have any tentativeness. They're pretty dogmatic in their answer to that question. So are there any legitimate scientists we could ask who come to different conclusions than Rosenberg and Pinker? Well, Rebecca McLaughlin, again, in this book, Confronting Christianity, she lives within walking distance of MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And I think most people, regardless of what they believe, would agree that there's some fairly legitimate scientists there. So she writes that if you probably stopped a random student in the hall, I guess there's an infinite corridor that runs for like almost 900 feet through the main part of the campus building. And if you asked one of those students if there were many Christian, professors there, they probably would guess that there's not. But she knows a number of them. So nuclear science professor Ian Hutchinson, professor of aeronautics and astronautics Daniel Hastings, electrical engineering professor Jing Kong, biological and mechanical engineering professor Linda Griffith, chemistry professor Troy Van Voorhis. And none of those 5 were raised as Christians, by the way. For instance, Troy Van Voorhis became a Christian in grad school at Berkeley. So that's not all. She names a number of others. Artificial intelligence expert Rosalind Picard, neuroscientist and former MIT president. She was the first female president of MIT, Susan Hockfield. They're all Christians. So that's just MIT. That's not to say anything of Oxford and Cambridge and Stanford, and there are a number of Christian professors in science, in the sciences, in each of those schools. You could mention Francis Collins, who led the Human Genome Project and is now the director of the National Institutes of Health. Collins, for instance, had a secular upbringing. He became an atheist during his university years. When he was a junior doctor, though, he had a patient, a woman who was suffering untreatable pain, but the manner in which she suffered was conspicuous to Collins, and she shared her faith with him and then asked him what he believed. And he was set back on his heels, his face flushed, and he said, "I'm not really sure." And the whole incident just caused him to explore what he believed, and that exploration led him to Jesus. So why do I mention all those names, all those people? This isn't some, smarmy name-dropping thing here. I'm simply making the point that science is not inherently incompatible with Christian faith. I think it would be crazy to think that all of these professors just somehow either check their brains at the door when they leave the office, or somehow just live in 2 different worlds as if their faith and their work have nothing to do with one another. These are smart people, thoughtful people that want to live integrated lives. And so the point is that science is not inherently, necessarily incompatible with Christian faith. So that's easy for me to say as a pastor. It could be kind of cheap for me to say it. A scientist could challenge me and say, well, it's because you're ignorant of the scientific data. But here are top flight scientists for whom their faith is not undermined by the data, let alone their faith being disproved. So on the contrary, you have testimonies like that of Cambridge professor of experimental physics, Russell Calburn. He said, understanding more of science doesn't make God smaller. It allows us to see his creative activity in more detail. Or we could go back to Lord Kelvin. So he lived 1824 to 1907. He's the one after whom the Kelvin unit of temperature is named. He did important work on the formulation of the first and second laws of thermodynamics as well. And he said, I've long felt that there was a general impression in the non-scientific world that the scientific world believes science has discovered ways of explaining all the facts of nature without adopting any definite belief in a creator. And then he says, I've never doubted that impression was utterly groundless. He was a committed Christian. So we could multiply examples along those lines, but I think we can push a little bit further here and say, not only does science not disprove or undermine Christian faith, but what if Christian faith is the most compatible worldview for embracing and pursuing science? So ironically, to a very significant degree, we owe our modern scientific method to the Christian worldview, to Christians. So, second question in the outline is, what are the origins of modern science and the scientific method? So we know that modern science was developed in large part by scientists who identified as Christians. So Roger Bacon and William of Ockham lived in the 1200s. You know, Occam's razor, if you were paying attention in your philosophy class, that's the William of Ockham, Occam's razor. And so those two were Christians, and they laid the very early groundwork for our modern empirical scientific method. Francis Bacon lived in the latter half of the 1500s and early 1600s. He's typically credited with developing the scientific method. He was a devout Christian. Robert Boyle lived in the 1600s, and he's considered the first modern chemist and also one of the pioneers of modern scientific methodology, and he was a devout Christian. We could also note that institutes of higher education like Oxford, Cambridge, Yale, Harvard, Princeton, they were all founded as explicitly Christian institutions. And certainly they had faculty members in science that were believers. The original motto of Harvard was Veritas Christo et Ecclesiae, truth for Christ and the church. Obviously, those schools have moved in their location on the ideological map, but this is their real history. Galileo, 1500s, latter half of the 1500s, first half of the 1600s, was a Christian. He's variously referred to as the father of observational astronomy, the father of the scientific method, the father of modern physics, and the father of modern science. Einstein and Stephen Hawking both credit him, Galileo, more than any other, as the father of modern science. Speaking of Einstein, he had three primary scientific heroes. Isaac Newton, who was probably more a deist. He didn't have an orthodox view of Jesus, didn't believe in his full deity. But Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell, those were Einstein's three scientific heroes, and both Faraday and Maxwell were Christians. So the question is not only, is it incompatible? No, obviously not. But was the Christian faith of these scientists, who were a key part of the development of what we call modern science, was their faith incidental, unrelated to their scientific work, or was it fundamental? Was it foundational? Well, Princeton professor and philosopher of science, Hans Halvorson, writes of these early scientists. He says that they, believe that the universe was designed by God, quote, according to a blueprint that can be discerned by rational creatures like ourselves. And the only way to discover the blueprint is by means of empirical investigation. So he says, understanding the history of these scientists, understanding who they were and how they operated, he says that they believed that the universe was designed by God, that there was a blueprint that could be discovered and understood precisely because there was this beautiful infinite mind, this designer, this superintelligence behind it all. And therefore it could be explored and understood by our rational minds because we were made in the image of that super rational deity. So third point now, let's take a few examples of some fields of study that typically there's lots of debate and argument, oftentimes claims to undermine or disprove Christian faith. So first off, evolution versus creation. One thing that's worth noting here is Darwin's closest collaborator was Asa Gray. He was a Harvard professor and botanist, and Darwin wrote to him. They carried on kind of a voluminous correspondence. Darwin said of him, actually to him, he said it to him in one of the letters, "There's hardly anyone in the world whose approbation, whose approval I value more highly than I do yours." And Gray was a Christian. And Darwin's work did not convince him otherwise. And in fact, he tried to convince Darwin to return to Christianity because Darwin had some background in Christianity in his upbringing. So this whole issue of evolution versus creationism, there are plenty of secular critics of Darwinian evolution. It's not universally assumed or without its critics. But the big question is often how the creation account in the Bible squares with the age of the earth and the fossil record, etc. So again, we could take a whole 30 minutes. We could take much longer than that to try to explore this question. But the question I would just want to ask is briefly, do we know as Christians how old the earth is? No. There are young earth estimates, and they have Christians that believe that viewpoint, they have their arguments. There are older earth estimates, Christians that believe in an older earth, and they have their arguments. The reason I state it this way is to say that Orthodox Christianity is not hinge on the age of the earth. And in fact, I think sometimes the debates over the Genesis account of creation, there's often attempts at finding scientific specificity in the text that was never intended. It's just not there to be found. So one biblical scholar wrote, "It's wrong to use Genesis as if it were directly furnishing information in modern scientific form." So do Christians believe that Genesis is an historical account? Yes, absolutely. Do they believe Adam and Eve were the first human persons, specially and directly created by God? Yes. And maybe many people on that basis alone would just write off Christianity. But interestingly, two scholars recently published a study, this is last year, 2019, that it is scientifically possible that human beings descended from a single human couple. So, there's so many studies out there, and sometimes there's, hack scientists that can, publish on the internet. Anybody can get something published. But these are people with credentials here. So Ola Hosier is professor of mathematical statistics at Stockholm University in Sweden. He's done research in statistics and probability theory with applications in population genetics, epidemiology, and insurance mathematics. This article goes on to give, some of his, credentials. And then the other researcher was Anne Gauger. And so she has a BS in biology from MIT, a PhD in developmental biology from University of Washington, has done postdoc fellowship work at Harvard. And so they put this paper out to say that there is good scientific reason to believe that this is a genuine possibility. And so, this is not something where that view is impossible on the basis of the scientific data and models and what these scientists understand about how genetic trees work, how I'm struggling, I'm not the scientist, but trying to use their language here. Genealogical trees and human ancestry and the data that's available. So this kind of leads me to the last point, which is, what about miracles? So, you can have people that would just write this off because how could, people be just created from dust? That's just impossible. That doesn't seem to square. Miracles alone are reason enough for plenty of people to say, I reject the Christian faith. The very fact that Christianity is predicated on, founded on certain miraculous phenomena means for some people that it cannot be true. Virgins don't conceive. Humans can't command storms to stop with a word. Demons don't exist. There are other psychological and physiological explanations. Miraculous healings don't occur. There's some other medical explanation. Dead people don't rise from the grave. So that kind of miraculous phenomena, began to face significant skepticism, during the Enlightenment. And now that we are enlightened and know so much more about the nature of the world and medicine and brain science and laws of physics, we know that there's no such thing as the miraculous. That's what many people would say. But what if there's a leap of faith in that reasoning? So science can do empirical testing to discover natural causes for seemingly supernatural phenomena. Okay? But it cannot prove that no other causes exist. That is a matter of faith. So here's the point. Natural causes are the only kind of causes that science can test. Science cannot prove that no other causes exist. Where would that test be to prove that no other causes exist? So this confident claim is actually untestable. It's unprovable. In fact, it creates a circular argument. Why don't you believe in miracles? Well, science can't test for them, therefore they can't exist. So Alvin Plantinga is a philosopher. He gives a helpful illustration of what this kind of reasoning is like. He says, the very practice of science requires that one reject the idea, for instance, of God raising someone from the dead. This argument is like the drunk who insisted on looking for his lost car keys only under the streetlight, on the grounds that the light was better there. In fact, it would go the drunk one better. It would insist that because the keys would be hard to find in the dark, they must be under the light. In other words, if it can't be determined by scientific empirical testing, it can't be. It can't exist. So saying miracles can't occur is actually a philosophical presupposition. It's not a scientific observation. So we are now at the level of faith commitments, even for atheists and materialists. So if a scientist says there can't be a God who does miracles, he's welcome to say that. She's welcome to believe that. But it's not a scientific claim. It's a faith claim. So if there is a God, we can expect there to be design and laws by which the world is governed. Otherwise, the world would be random and chaotic. But if there is a God who created and designed everything, that same God could most certainly intervene at times in a supernatural way and do the miraculous. And that wouldn't be surprising at all. It's a faith claim, but so is the claim that there is no God and that there can be no miracles. So think about it this way. The laws of science do not cause what they describe or what they summarize. They merely give labels to observable patterns and norms. Okay, so think of certain laws of science, laws of thermodynamics or motion or whatever, right? Law of gravity. The fact that there are observable, reliable patterns and laws by which this world works does not prove that anomalies can't happen, can't take place. So it's not logically necessary to view scientific laws as proof that anomalies can't happen, can't exist. It's illogical to ascribe the power of miracle prevention to laws that simply describe how the world typically works. The law is a description of what normally happens. It's not a power that prevents all anomalies from ever occurring. The laws describe observable, predictable patterns. They have no causative or preventative force. It's actually those very laws, or more precisely, the universe's regularity and predictability that God built into it, that enables us to recognize a miracle or an anomaly when it shows up. So, yes, I need to stay in my lane. We all could heed that advice to stay in our lane, but I think we also need to consider the fact that scientists need to realize when they venture into the realm of the metaphysical and faith claims about what can't be true and what can't happen, they are actually out of their typical lane and into the realm of faith and metaphysics. So hopefully that's some helpful food for thought under the question of, hasn't science disproved or at least undermined Christianity? No, we don't believe it has, and hopefully some of those thoughts have been helpful for you to consider how you would respond to that question. Thanks for joining us.